So hello and welcome everyone. Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today as we talk about health technology assessment. My name is Tushar Srivastava, Director and Principal Consultant at Connect HUR and Method Researcher at the University of Sheffield, UK. I'm your host and co-moderator for this webinar. I'm joined by Dr. Radha Shukla, who will be co-moderating this webinar with me. Radha is consultant in Connect HUR and a global public health researcher, and who did her PhD from University of York recently. After today's talk, you will carry with you some understanding on historical events which supported the needs of health technology assessment, journey of HTA over time, and key objective and policy questions which HTA helps to understand and answer. And just a little housekeeping before we start. This webinar is being recorded and we will send the sessions recording your way in coming days. So do not worry about making notes immediately. Please ask your questions into the question box in your Zoom control panel, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Also, please feel free to upvote any question that others ask, as we will discuss the most voted questions at the end with the speaker. We will be summarizing the webinar content under our blog section on the website later, in which we will also post any unanswered questions with their answers. So we encourage you to ask questions. And any technical issues, feel free to type into the chat box and Kunal and Radha will be able to help you with that. So without further ado, it is with great pleasure to introduce you to our today's speaker, Professor Egon Jonsson. Professor Jonsson, who has been a key persona in formation and development of HTA over the years. His expertise includes knowledge on regulatory requirements of pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and other health technologies and services in many European countries, Canada, United States, and many Asian countries as well. Professor Jonsson received his PhD from Stockholm School of Economics and MBA also from the same institute in Sweden, and further training at Howard School of Public Health in the United States. He was one of the founders of HTAI, a society and scientific journal, founder and leader of the WHO Health Evidence Network, served as the CEO of Swedish Agency for HTA, CEO of the Institute of Health Economics in Edmonton, Canada, and worked as a long-term advisors to ministers and ministries of health in Sweden, Vietnam, and the government of Alberta as well. So yeah, please welcome Professor Jonsson as I pass the stage to him. And in the meantime, let me pull out his slides for the presentation. Professor Jonsson is on you, and let me.
Okay, welcome everybody. I have been active in the field of HTA, health technology assessment, since my childhood, essentially. And often I have had questions from family, friends, and relatives about what I'm doing in my professional life. I have never been able to clearly and convincingly explain what health technology assessment is. Especially when it comes to my children. When my daughter was about 5-6 years old, and I explained it for her, she said after my explanation that, "Oh, I see you look after machines and screw on them so they really work. I guess somebody has to do that too." Not really, but I thought then and now that it would be fantastic good to have a concept for HTA which immediately explains what it is about. Something like evidence-based medicine, or although that is reserved for clinicians and their individual patients. My son, likewise, at a young age, concluded that after my explanation of HTA with a question, are you what they call an engineer? No, not that either, but sometimes I really wish I were. Now, HTA has been around for more than 40 years now. Many people do not understand that it started long before evidence-based medicine, long before many other movements in healthcare that HTA was supposed to deal with and really did. But there are now indeed many people working in the field. There are policymakers in governments and researchers at the agencies and institutes, and not the least at universities, in consulting companies serving both industry, academia, and governments. Researchers in HTA are found now all around the world in many countries. I made a crude estimate of the volume and found that there must be around 5,000 to 10,000 people working in the field of HTA. That's a considerable amount of people for one profession. And most of them probably are found in North America, Europe, and China. Although there are quite a few also in other places of Asia and South America, Australia, and in several of the former republics of the Soviet Union, including Russia. Another question I often get is, when did technology become part of medicine? Over the thousands of years of the practice of medicine, there are simply too many technologies to be listed and told about during this brief seminar. So here is a list, if I can have my next slide, of some of them selected, hard selection. I have drawn from a book of my friend and colleague Stanley Reiser. He was professor of ethics at Harvard and now at the University of Texas at Austin. He has written several books about technology in medicine. And some of what I'm saying now is, I draw heavily on Stanley Reiser's books. Anyway, the main tools for diagnosing in medicine early in the history was the art of listening to the patient's subjective experiences and making observations of the appearance of the patient's, his or her facial expression, his manner of breathing, color of the tongue, color of the skin, blood, urine, and stools. Although many people worked on developing devices for medical use in the history of medicine, it was not until the beginning of what we call the ages of enlightenment, around 1650, that technologies as we know it began to appear and eventually came into widespread use in medicine. And many of them are still important to this very day in January of 2022. The microscope was developed in many different stages by several researchers, but finally made in perfection by the Dutch scientist Anton Leeuwenhoek. With his microscope, it was possible to see both bacteria and virus. However, it took almost 100 years after the presentation of his microscope that physicians in general accepted the fact that there is actually a whole universe of things we cannot see without a microscope. Anton Leeuwenhoek is nowadays also known as the father of microbiology. Although Hippocrates, about 2,300 years ago, developed the basic aspects of auscultation, to listen to the sounds of the body. A technology for that purpose was not developed until 1816 by the French doctor, physician René Laennec, who called it the stethoscope. Stanley Reiser would most likely say that the microscope and the stethoscope clearly forms a demarcation line when technology enters medicine and become important tools in the practice of this occupation. Checking the pulse was not accurately measured until 1856. By the way, it was not very common in physical examinations of the patient. It was accurately developed only after both Daniel Fahrenheit and Anders Celsius stepped in and developed a trustworthy technology named the thermometer. The vaccine was available or tried already 1796. And it's a matter of taste, whether we should call it an invention or a technology, a discovery. But clearly the cell doesn't fit here. But I put it in just because I wanted to place it in time where it is, when it was discovered, 1858 by Virchow. And a few other people were involved as well. But this is an invention, a discovery that seemed to have had more Nobel Prizes in medicine than any other discovery. By the way, the most essential criteria for a Nobel Prize is that it must be a discovery. It cannot be a full-blown technology. But there is one exception from that rule, and I will talk about it pretty soon. When it comes to treatments throughout the history of medicine, it seems well documented that the Indian Ayurveda and Syrian and Mediterranean traditions of healing by diet and herbal treatment and yogic breathing was widely used in treatment of both diseases and disabilities early on, from around 3,000 years ago. And that traditional Chinese medicine, including acupuncture, was practiced already 2,500 years ago. As was many activities on matters of healthy living and medicine in the Yellow Emperor's classic on internal medicine, which remarkably was translated and republished as late as 1940s. Anyway, HTA was established to assist with evidence, and so that healthcare would not be doing more harm than good. More specifically, HTA was there to review scientific evidence that technologies used in diagnosing and treatment are safe and do what they are supposed to do, which also is called efficacy. Safety has been a general concern in healthcare for a very long time, and this is shown here in this slide, which may be the first documented effort of protecting patients from more harm than good. It was a Collegium Medicorum in the country of Sweden established to, so this is taken from the document about establishing this organization, to distinguish quackery from medicine, to control the trade of poisonous drugs, and banish all swindlers who grease people with their fake, fraudulent, and harmful medicaments. This is more or less exactly what HTA also would like to do if it was at that time, 350 years ago, 1663. Today, there are regulations in place in essentially all countries, at least most countries around the world, and these regulations are focused not only on safety, which means that a technology needs to have the risk known. The safety is the same as we know the risk. But we also need to know efficacy, which means that the technology do what it is supposed to do. For example, that an ultrasound of an embryo actually shows the embryo. And finally, also, these regulations of today requires that we know what and how a technology can tell us about the impact on health, which is called effectiveness. However, the regulations we have now, appreciated for a long time, did not fall from the sky. Instead, it was put in place only after huge disasters involving large groups of patients treated with experimental technologies, which did not have evidence of neither safety or efficacy. Several such disasters happened during the time the need for HTA was discussed in the early 1970s. Shortly before that, we had several examples of experimental and thoughtless therapies, like the thalidomide disaster and the total unethical frontal lobotomy procedure, and the widespread use of opinion-based medicine. And then at the same time, there was a book coming out about the need to do randomized controlled trial. Book was written by a famous person nowadays in the field we are into on HTA and evidence-based medicine and what have you. His name was Archie Cochrane. He was an epidemiologist at Cambridge University, no, Cardiff University. And he was one of his mentors was Bradford Hill. Incidentally, I met with Archie and we became very good friends already in the beginning of the 70s. When I was at the Harvard School of Public Health, he came there to lecture. And since then we were very good friends, communicated by letters. There was no internet at that time, which surprises many people, I guess. It wasn't until the mid-1990s that internet was available in Europe. Anyway, Archie Cochrane asked his mentor, Bradford Hill, who was the big epidemiologist in the UK at that time. And he did a study together with Richard Dahl that showed the connection between cigarette smoking and lung cancer already in the 1950s, I think it was. Anyway, Archie Cochrane asked, he told me this. I think he has it in his book as well, but I hadn't read it then when he told me about it. And he asked Bradford Hill, how far should we go with this randomization businesses? And Bradford Hill said, you should randomize until it hurts. And at this time also, Archie told about his neighbor. He had a little house with a garden in Cardiff, or was it in Cambridge? And over the fence there was hanging a man every day, his neighbor, talking about his job, which Archie were not interested in at all, because the man, his neighbor, was working in the crematorium, and it didn't interest Archie at all. So one day he asked him, his neighbor, what makes you so fascinated by your work? And the man was thinking for a long time, was absolutely quiet. And after 3-4 minutes, he said, the main reason for my fascination about my own job is to see how much is going into it and how little is coming out. And Archie said with his sense of humor that I was thinking of recommending this man to take a job in the National Health Services instead, because that would increase his job satisfaction significantly. This was the view at the time of when HTA was thought of being established. Cochrane was a very entertaining man. He told about his time in the Second World War, that he was put in southwest of Greece to walk back and forth along the shore, the sandy shore there, for several days. And when the Germans came suddenly one day with tanks and everything and thousands of soldiers, and he was the only one they were out for. And he was thinking for a while to jump into the Mediterranean Sea and try to swim over to Egypt, but he didn't have the powers for that, so he gave up and he became a prisoner of war. And he had since then quite a lot of experience with the randomized controlled trials under difficult circumstances, in many prisoner camps around the world. He was also for a while involved in the Spanish War, and actually met with a drunkard in a bar in Barcelona, and his name was Ernest Hemingway. And they discussed memories of war. Anyway, under these circumstances, under such with being a prisoner of war, he didn't hesitate to experiment with things because there was no effective treatment whatsoever. At one place in Greece, in one place, a prisoner of war, as a prisoner of war, he didn't have anything to give seriously hurt soldiers who came in on a stream, and some of his patients were screaming right out in pain. He had nothing to give them except some Greek marmalade, but he pretended it was a medication, and often it worked. And he started to think about the placebo effect of many things. And he started to think that many of the things we are providing people with are not what we think they are, and they should absolutely be tried in randomized controlled trials. So that was his book about. And but at the beginning of HTA in the 70s, there was also a growing concern about the increasing cost of health services in relation to his actual achievements, along with the insight that higher levels of health spending doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes, and that technology contributes significantly to both increased costs and improved health outcomes. To the concepts of safety, efficacy, and effectiveness must therefore be added another fourth dimension of HTA, namely cost effectiveness. Most people who has written about the history of HTA agree that it began in the mid-1970s. The US Congress had established, next slide, an Office of Technology Assessment, OTA, was established 1972 to support the Congress with assessments suitable for policymaking in, for example, space technologies, transportation technologies, agricultural, anti-ballistic technologies, ocean technologies, climate technologies, supersonic technologies, environmental technologies already then. It was good. And health technologies was added to OTA's program in 1974. And an important development in that was that they managed to hire a young doctor from Manhattan in New York to start leading the newly established Department of Health Technology Assessment at OTA at that time. And he was really instrumental in getting HTA going, and he has written numerous studies. I think he must have 400 or 500 quotations in the field, and I mean references to his papers in the field. Now, it should also be mentioned that at this time in the 1970s, the only discussion about effectiveness and efficiency of the health services was not at all about their scientific basis. It was not at all about the art of medicine. It was not at all about anything else than was something called ALOS. It is average length of stay, ALOS, average length of stay in hospitals. The average length of stay seemed to occupy all administrators at that time. It was a time also when administration in healthcare started to develop. It exploded, actually. And another researcher told me at Harvard that when I was young, he said, when you look at a city from the distance, the biggest building in any city, in any village, was the church. Later, it became the biggest building in the city was a hospital, a main hospital. And even later, the biggest building in any city was the administration of the hospital. So that says something how quickly it grew, and especially
Professor Jonsson, just
yes.
a time check. We have about 10-15 minutes more to present.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, I will cut back some of this talking. Then can we have the next slide? Tushar, yeah. Technology actually means applied science. So health technologies assessment is an evaluation of applied science. It evaluates the medical, social, ethical, legal, organizational, and economic implications of technology, including drugs, devices, medical and surgical procedures, to be short about it. HTA is a multidisciplinary form of scientific research to synthesize evidence to support both health policy and health practices. Next slide. Well, here are the 4 cornerstones, as OTA called them, when they published the first reports. Safety is that the risk of the technology is known. If we know the risk, we can make judgments about whether it is worth to take it or not. But we have to have some kind of safety, that the risk of the technology is known. Efficacy is the technology, is a question about that we know whether the technology is doing what it is supposed to do. The history of medicine, particularly in the 1900s, is full of trials of different treatments and diagnosing and treatments where people didn't really know what their technology was supposed to do. Effectiveness, how does it impact patient health? And cost effectiveness is, of course, cost related to health outcomes. Next slide. I have chosen 4 events which supported the establishing of health technology assessment. And the first one was, of course, horrific treatments in history. The thalidomide scandal was a drug. It was a drug that was given to pregnant women for morning sickness, but also for many other things, from treatment of diabetes to treatment of obesity, and many things that the company said it worked for. Many babies started to come out, be born without limbs, without arms, without legs. Next slide. Oh, okay. The thalidomide was, when it came to the United States, it was a stop. A lady in FDA, Federal Drug Agency, who was actually from Canada, she was a pharmacist and a doctor in the field. Take away this slide, please. I'm talking about thalidomide. And so this, yes. She was not convinced that the company had any evidence from human testing on pregnant women. And she suspected that many of the early reports from Germany, where the drug first was marketed and sold in the mid-1950s, and it went on until the beginning of the 1960s. She asked the company of evidence of trials on pregnant women, which they couldn't provide, because all of the experiments were done on mouses and not on people. So this was a tremendous disaster. Tens of thousands of children had their lives destroyed. And about 50% of them died within a couple of months old. Next slide now. Another horrific treatment from this time, shortly before HTA was established, was the frontal lobotomy. Here are very nice things put in the eyes and touching the brain. And those who did that was not necessarily surgeons who would know what they were doing. It was neurologists and psychiatrists who did this experiment. Usually they used an ice pick to bang it in with a hammer through the eyes and shaking the brain. So that was the treatment. It's like you throw something you throw a big stone into a computer. You see that the computer is shaking, but you had no clue what is happening in the computer. So, but nevertheless, without any evidence of anything that is good, not even evidence of harm, the inventor of this procedure was a Portuguese doctor who he got the Nobel Prize in 1949. This is the only scandal in the Nobel Prize history of it. Next slide. Opinion-based medicine can do also a lot of harm. Dr. Benjamin Spock, a very respected doctor at that time, produced this and many other books, Baby and Child Care. This book was sold in 50 million copies, not 19 million copies, as it's shown here. It was 50 million copies all over the world. And his advice throughout the book is generally good. But when it comes to where some mothers asked him, how should the baby be laying, on the back or on the stomach when they were going to sleep? And he recommended, on the basis of his own opinion, that it's probably best to place them on their stomach. Well, that has been shown later to be the main reason for early infant mortality syndrome. I don't remember what it is called, but there have been many over the years, many explanations for sudden infant death syndrome. But one of them, it was a study done in the UK in the 70s that showed that the cause was actually Benjamin Spock's recommendations. And the authors estimate that at least 10,000 babies around the world died because of this recommendation. So opinion-based medicine can really be dangerous. And we must go for evidence-based medicine instead. Next slide. Yeah, this is a picture of Archie Cochrane himself. He wrote this book, Effectiveness and Efficiency, Random Reflections on Health Services, where he convincingly and very nicely explained why we must do randomized controlled trials until it hurts. And next slide. So here we have those four. And well, we also have a remarkable technology that came in 1972. It was developed by the electronic medical industry. It was called EMI. And in the UK, it was more or less totally owned by the Beatles, the pop group, the Beatles. 30% of the income of EMI came from selling of Beatles records. And they had, of course, no clue that in one corner of their company, there was an engineer doing experiments. Here is his of a medical device. Here is his first Can we move this untitled poll in another so we can see the prototype of this technology? And is anyone knows what it is? Yeah, we have. Okay. So anyway, I think we go to next slide and see what technology came out of this experiment. The CT scanner and Cochrane marks the very beginning of HTA in 1974. The CT scanner took the word with surprise. A lot of old-fashioned, dangerous, painful technologies disappeared overnight, especially those technologies used to examine cancer in the brain, which required painful examinations with patients hanging up and down in a chair in the roof of the laboratory, while either air or liquid, colored liquid went into the brain, and people were screaming. This disappeared overnight when the CT scanner came. And this was the first this is the first technology that got the Nobel Prize already very fast, 9 years after it's when it came to the market. It came to the market about 73, 74. And it was extremely expensive compared to other things at that time. So the policy decision makers demanded the following: a synthesis of what are the medical, ethical, organizational, social, and economic implications of this technology, along with a thorough comparison of the alternatives. That would require comparative assessments between different technologies. If we take a look at something like, for example, back pain, which is a very common syndrome. 80% of all people have back pain sometime in their life. How many technologies are there to potentially treat back pain? Well, I happen to know it because we did a thorough examination of this field a long time ago. There is still about 40 different technologies in use to try to treat back pain. And it still seems to be that physical activity and movement is the best technology for back pain, although there are many others. And back pain is not only back pain, it's many different things. But I'm talking about unspecific back pain. So in every disease, there are many technologies, and not only CT scanners, there are many other things. In terms of diagnosing back pain, there are about 15 different technologies in use. Next slide. The development of OTA and their program on health technologies inspired many researchers in Europe. The first agency was established in Sweden in the 1980s. It was followed by 14 more agencies in Europe within a period of about 10 years. In Spain, many agencies in different parts of Spain and different, yeah. And in France, 2, Holland 1, Poland 1, Finland 1, Norway 1. In UK, NICE was established finally after long discussions. And then it took really high speed, not only in the UK, but also further inspiration in many other countries. Germany and Scotland. Next slide. And the agencies were established in Canada. 3 of them we have here now. I'm in Canada at the moment. In Australia, 2 or possibly many more now. South America, 5. Malaysia, Thailand, South Korea. There is South Africa also. And in China, there is certainly more, but I only know about 2 of them. But there are certainly more centers or agencies of the government doing health technology assessment. Some other developments of importance which synergize HTA are as follows. There has been a sustainable demand for HTAs because it's so popular in political circles. Policymakers and ministries have seen or understand that it really can help them in both regulating health services, in making it more effective, and perhaps cut down on its costs. Databases of scientific studies has developed. The first one was in 1966, Medline, but since then many other databases have been established. Personal computers and internet, as I mentioned before, internet came to Europe in the mid-1990s, and personal computers came at the same time. It's not more than 25 years ago. It's unbelievable what has happened during that time. Political and academic support played a very important role for HTA. Next, software and skills to retrieve and synthesize information. And an international society was formed. It was named ISTAC. The name was changed in 2003 to HTAI. And a scholarly journal with Cambridge University Press was launched in 1985 with myself and Stanley Reiser as editors for the next 20 years or so. And that journal reached the top of 4,000 subscribers a few years ago. And these are things that synergize the HTA. The use of the findings from HTA, what can it be used for? First of all, a basis for innovations in health services. Second, reimbursement decisions can be helpful with an HTA in the background. Development of guidelines, popular today, and it can be used to control the diffusion and use of technology. Not all hospitals need, for example, a CT scanner, but an HTA can tell how should CT scanners be diffused in the country. Next, assist in health policy decision-making and also to some extent in clinical decision-making. Next. The World Health Organization set up something called the Health Evidence Network, the HEN. And the questions posed to the HEN, the ministries of the European Office of WHO was providing this service to 57 ministries of health, and they came in with questions. For example, like this, here are some examples of questions. What are the most effective diagnostic and therapeutic strategies for the management of depression in specialist care? It's not going into any specific technology. This is the usual way policymakers are asking for problems to be solved. They ask, what is the best way to treat depression? What is the best way to prevent suicide among young people, etc.? What are the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of home compared with hospital and satellite unit hemodialysis for people with end-stage renal failure? How effective are different types of daycare services for people with severe mental disorder? And also, we had over 50 ministers of health at one meeting at WHO in Copenhagen to talk about this HEN, and they really appreciate it. But they said, we specifically like that it's not more than 10 pages or 10, 15 pages. We try to keep it down to 10, 15 pages. And here are a few other most effective. So, are bigger hospitals better? Next, are routine dental checks useful? Which are the best treatment of dementia, etc. But they said also, can you make short answers, 1 page or even 1 sentence? So we did that. What is the efficacy, effectiveness of antenatal care? It can be answered by this. It's necessary, but should be kept at a simplified level. What are the main risk factors for disability in old age, and how can disability be prevented? Encourage also the elderly to exercise. Which are the most effective and cost-effective interventions for tobacco control? Straightforward, permanent price increases and bans on advertising. Next slide. So here is finally the timeline summary of events in the journey of formation of HTA. Health technology added to OTA in 1974. Discovery of CT scanner and the Cochrane's book, and later in 2000 and what is that? 1980, first agency outside of US established in Sweden. Next, HTAC was formed in collaboration of WHO at a meeting in Copenhagen. In 1993, the INATA was formed. INATA means International Network of Agencies in HTA. It was formed in 1993, which is almost 30 years ago. And HTAC changed its name to HTAI in 2003. Next. And the journal reached the 4,000 subscriber base in 2010. So it's a popular journal. Present state of HTA, we cannot do more slides now. It's based on findings from scientific studies on the safety, efficacy, effectiveness, and cost effectiveness of both new and established technologies in healthcare. It has a strong political support in countries where it is established, and it is known for providing synthesis of findings from research that is useful in health policy making and also in health practices. Next. HTAs are produced and used by governments, academia, and industry. Right now, there is some progress in one project that I am personally involved in, using artificial intelligence in HTAs. So we stop there. There are currently 52 agencies in more than 30 countries. There are an estimated 15 more agencies in HTA. Together with researchers working on HTAs in universities, industries, and the consulting sector, there are an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 researchers in this field. That's what I have said before. Now, shall we stop there and leave for questions?
Thank you, Professor. I think that was very insightful. And it was great to see how HTS come into existence and the history. We have a few questions. I'll start with the one that's popped up on my window just yet. There's a question that how is reimbursement defined and applied in the light of new coverage models and expanded service packages?
Am I supposed to answer?
Yes, please.
That question,
it's just open to discussion.
It's a very good question, but it's not time, and I need to think about it. So we can put that question into the ones
Sure.
we need to respond to
Sure.
by a written answer to
Sure.
the speaker.
And we will be sharing the presentation and the material. So any questions that we will be answering later, we will send in with the recorded material afterwards as well. So thank you. There's another question, if we can answer right now, is about the artificial intelligence that you just mentioned a little while ago. What's the application of that in HTA, and how will that change the dynamics in the coming time?
I would think that it can change HTA, not change it, but it can make HTA being done. Today, it's different in different agencies. Some agencies, all agencies are doing assessments of drugs, and all agencies are also doing other things, like comparative effectiveness of other technologies in medicine. And it takes quite a lot of time to finalize. When I was the head of the Swedish agency on health technology assessment in healthcare, it could take more than 5 years to finalize a project, like the one that we had on treatment of different diseases by radiotherapy. It took a long time to finish that one. It took more than 5 years. But there are usually at least 1 year or 2 years to finish an HTA. I think with artificial intelligence, people who are really experts in the field think that we can do an HTA in a couple of weeks in the future. So that is clearly the most important outcome of an HTA using artificial intelligence. However, There is also, we did the first study we did was to look at the ability for artificial intelligence to review randomized controlled trials and accurately predict that all studies looked at are actually randomized controlled trials and nothing else. We found that with the tools that scientific librarians have today, there were in this particular study about 1,600 randomized controlled trials. However, when HTA looked at it, it was about 100 less than what was found by the tools that scientific librarians have now. And we had 4 people going through each and every study, and we could actually conclude that the machine, the AI deep learning, was more correct than anything else.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Professor Jonsson, there's also a couple of good questions, but I think the one basic one which I would like to talk about is there a difference between HTA and evidence-based medicine? Are there 2 different terms, or it's the same thing that's just interchangeably used?
It's basically the same thing. However, evidence-based medicine is more looking into clinical details of how to best treat patients.
Okay.
While HTA is also concerned about the overall policy-making aspects of diagnosing and treatment at population level.
Great. There's another fantastic question where they say that, do we feel that when we measure quality so adjusted life years, that is QALY, is well enough in the current way we measure it in terms of its importance, given its enough importance in making decisions?
I cannot agree more with that person who put that question. It's very important, and it's coming more and more, and also it's coming more and more. And there are many ways of assessing quality of life. But although I think that some of the methodologies are more common than others. But what is a strong movement, I would say, at the moment, and there was a special issue of the International Journal of Technology Assessment in Healthcare recently. I think it was the latest issue, was and edited by some people I know, and they conclude that something called PPI, which is patient and public engagement, inclusion in HTA, is very important. Based on 2,000 studies published in the journal over the years, which are touching on the subject of patients include patients in the decision making about findings from HTAs, and also the public. As a matter of fact, in Sweden, we established what is called ambassadors for an ambassador program for HTA, where renowned health economists, epidemiologists, and clinicians were appointed as ambassadors to the agency of HTA. And they were out there trying to explain what HTA is and how important it is with evidence and evidence-based for medicine. That is nothing new today, but it needs to be reminded all the time. Recently, a publication by a few researchers in the US showed that in the US service, about 50% of what is provided for the patients lack any kind of evidence. So it's needed it's really needed to remind us all how important it is. Otherwise, there can be a catastrophe at any moment.
True. And continuation from that, another question is, any advices or any advice for establishing a new HTA? One of the questions posed.
Well, first of all, that is an international community now, and particularly in the agency community of INATA, the International Network of Agencies in the field, to get in touch with that group. I mean, there is 30 years of experience with agencies for health technology assessment. And so there is much to learn from that. What I can say myself is to try to seek political support. That is a good way to start.
Thank you. And I think just I'll take one final question, which is very much related to the last comment you made about taking, political support. Is that, what do you think about the transferability and the generalizability of HTA across jurisdictions? And is it even possible?
I didn't understand the question.
The transferability and the generalizability of HTA across jurisdictions. I believe this person is trying to address that in different countries. Or...
all countries have different circumstances. First of all countries have different cultures and different values on certain things. So the transferability of from one country to another is certainly not straightforward, although much can be learned from the basic stuff of synthesizing the literature, reviewing the literature, synthesizing it, and so on and so forth. But the conclusions and recommendations for policy making needs definitely to be based on local circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Do we have more time for questions, Tushar? Should we conclude here?
I think we should conclude here, and anyhow we are going to answer all the rest of the questions on our blog.
Yes.
So rest assured that we are going to answer all of the questions we are not able to answer, which we are not able to answer live here. So not a problem in that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Radha, and thank you so much, Egon, for great presentation. It's such an insightful talk on HTA and taking us back to the history and and where it all started. So thank you so much on that. Really appreciate your time. And thank you so much to all those who attended this session, this live session, and to those who not able to make it, but they are watching the recording. So thank you for your time as well. Really appreciate it. And have a great rest of your day or evening, wherever you are. Stay safe, and thanks once again.